Hello and welcome to the new episode of this podcast. So today it's I would say, a special episode because, of course, we have always brought up a lot of former CI officers on this podcast, and primarily what we have discussed is either just a counterterrorism or just espionage cases or just a case study of a real time. But we never really had a episode which takes a cross-functional approach or an interdisciplinary approach that discusses all the aspects of counterterrorism, espionage, insider threat, all together, all at once in the same episode. So today we'll be discussing and diving deep into this topic, and it's really an honor to basically host today's guest speaker because I have seen her only on the documentary shows primarily from several well-known channels from Hollywood, and that's how basically I received her reference, and that's how I got in touch with her, and we have her on the podcast finally. So, without any delay, I would like to welcome her on the podcast, Gina Bennett. Hi, Gina. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it is great to have you on the episode. I mean, I have heard a lot of great things about your work. I have read about you as well through, of course, some of our previous CI officers who came on the podcast had also mentioned about your work as well. So that has
Oh,
been great. So before we start with the today's topic, that is inside the mind of a spy, counterterrorism, espionage, and the new insider war, I would like to know briefly about your journey, especially, I mean, like I personally know it, very frankly speaking, because I've read about you. But we have a very wider range of audience from space industry, defense, security, aviation, aerospace, maritime. So a lot of them are not so much familiar with this sector. So that would be great if you can provide a brief introduction about yourself and how you ended up doing
sure.
what you're doing at the moment.
Absolutely. So thank you again, and I hope I can live up to your expectations. They seem a little high for me, but we'll try. Basically the short version of my journey to this point, um, began really straight out of undergrad college. I took the first job I could get. I ended up working initially for Ronald Reagan was president at the time, and I was working at the Department of State for a few months in a summer program. Next thing you know, Pan Am 103, the terrorist bombing in 1988 occurred, and I got myself involved in the intelligence world at that point, in the investigation, really, of who done it. And it took a few years for us to figure that particular terrorist incident out. But that experience just really hooked me on counterterrorism. Probably because there was a huge population of students returning from their year of study abroad, and they were only a year younger than myself. And so it really resonated. It really hit home. And getting to meet with family members and realizing that they would never see their loved ones again, it just hit me and stayed with me. So I was hooked into the counterterrorism mission from the very beginning, really. Um, and at that time there were still Soviet troops in Afghanistan. It was quite the different world. We had Red Army factions all over the world that we were dealing with. The terrorism was just a completely different landscape. But there was a lot to do, and I was drawn into that mission. And in some ways, I've always told my friends I felt like the Forrest Gump of the counterterrorism world, because I just always ended up in the right place at the wrong time, or the wrong place at the right time, or whatever formulation of that. So that included watching the flow of volunteers who had been in Afghanistan helping the Afghan mujahideen kick the Soviet Union out. Those individuals started leaving, we began to see a new form of extremist movement coming out of that, which we later called the global jihad. But that's really, I just landed accidentally in counterterrorism because of that historical case in Pan Am 103 and how it connected with me, and just couldn't leave it. Just really couldn't leave it. Like, I always liken it to being like a a cop on the beat when you're looking for a serial killer. You just can't stop.
Yes. So that's a very amazing journey, I would say. But yeah, I think even though you were at the person, right person at the right time, and I think you could make the best out of the opportunity that you got. Uh, that's what I could say, because a lot of people, get the opportunity, but they are unable to make the best out of it. And looking at your journey, no one can basically make out the fact that you landed up maybe accidentally, in the intelligence and the counterterrorism department.
Yeah, no, accident of history. And then, stayed with it for 34 years. I retired
Yeah,
just 3 years ago. So,
that's
yeah.
interesting. Yes. So, to begin with, from your journey itself, of course, you have had experience in all these domains that we are going to discuss today. And we have also briefly discussed over the podcast what is insider threat, but still, I'd like to basically touch upon this part again. So we can start with the foundation question, that what exactly is insider risk management, and why is it relevant today than ever before across both the public
Mm,
and the private sectors?
yeah. Well, I want to start with the second part of that question because I find that really important. Why is it more relevant today? And there are, in my mind, there are two driving forces behind that. One is just the advancement of globalization and the interconnectedness of the world, period. People in one population in Michigan are connected to people in another population somewhere in Singapore. Like, it is just mind boggling how interconnected we all are.
Yes.
And with that, additionally, comes the interconnection of the private sector and the public sector. So within every country, I've always thought if people understood better that the private sector, for example, in the United States, is far more responsible for providing national security than the public sector. I mean, the public sector guides it and, of course, provides national defense. But in terms of the things that you need for security, it's really going to be the people working on the electrical grid and the people who are making sure your water is safe and the people who are making sure the stoplights work. I mean, there's so much private industry and private sector that is what creates your sense of security, your sense of stability and safety. And so that interconnection, I think, when you overlay that with the global interconnectivity, and then, of course, the internet and the cyber domain or the digital domain, whichever you prefer to call it, which undergirds everything. Nothing exists anymore without that pipeline. So that pipeline, like air, like water, like our other domains, creates opportunity and risk. So every time we use those pipelines, we are creating some form of risk. So with that, the risk is everywhere and potentially threatening everyone, however small it might be in comparison to all the normal and the good things that people use the internet for, that people, use water and air and space and for,
Yeah.
there's all that good stuff, but all of it then, of course, is um, vulnerable to that risk. So when you talk about the insider and insider risk management, you're getting into this very, I think it's not normal. You have to embrace that you have to look at this darker side of humanity. An
Yes.
individual or individuals who would be disloyal, who would be willing to harm or allow harm to the people that they coexist with. And it's a hard area to be in. But the more
Yes.
you create the opportunity, the more the risk is there, and the more you're going to have to work to prevent it. So I don't know. That's how I would generally see why it is so big or why it is more relevant and growing. In terms
Yes.
of what it is, again, to me, insider risk is about people in relationships and a loss of trust or a complete, break in trust and disloyalty, manipulation, whatever it might be. It's a very psychological human element that we're talking about. And I think sometimes one of the things I would say about risk management just in
Yeah.
general is there's necessarily a desire to quantify it, to rack and stack the factors in order to make the job of risk analysis accessible and provide solutions. All of that is fine, all of that is good, but sometimes that can also hide the human piece of it that I'm talking about and the emotional aspect of risk and insider risk especially, and how you have to manage insider risk. And I think that is often, I believe, what is not as well researched and invested in the solutions in that space. Does that help?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I'm coming to that point actually. Uh, I think during a conversation you had mentioned about, let me just recall it. I think the lack of belonging.
Yes.
So can you extend a little bit on that? Like you'd
Hmm.
mentioned that the most common motivator for insider risk is a lack of belonging to any
Right.
ecosystem or that environment. And how can organizations proactively create cultures of inclusions to mitigate this, basically?
Right. Yeah. So in all my research and work over the years, looking at counterterrorism and the intersection of counterterrorism, espionage, insider threat, insider risk, because terrorists are going to penetrate organizations and use them. I mean, they're just a specific kind of insider threat in many ways. So when you try to extrapolate from all of the cases that I've ever been involved in, the work over the years, and I also have studied how insider threat has presented itself in other sectors. I mean, one of the things we do as analysts at the CIA is a lot of structured analogies, a lot of research to in areas that don't seem like they have anything to do with what you're looking at. That's really important to challenge your thinking, challenge your assumptions, and it creates new knowledge and new findings. And so, in doing some of that work over the years, looking at sectors such as casinos or law enforcement, even the medical community, um, IP, in IT and software engineering and things like this, other than espionage, other than terrorism. And you start to see this pattern emerge of one of the main and most common driving forces behind the individual who chooses to act in a disloyal way to the community that they're working in, so the insider threat, is a sense of not fitting in, not belonging.
Yes.
It's not money that is the primary driver. And it really starts with that. Now, that is a hard finding because what do you do about that, right? Somebody's sense of belonging could very well be an individual perspective that you can't control for. But as an organization, to the extent that you can improve the sense of belonging for every single person in your employ, the less likely you're going to create this driving force for insider threat. So
Yeah.
the it has to, because again, it is not in our nature, in our human nature, to be disloyal to our family. And when you think about your workplace, if you're really attached to the people that you work with, they become your family. You spend more of your waking hours with your colleagues than you do your own family. Um,
Yes.
they become not just your family, but your mission becomes your future, your sense of purpose, united purpose together. And so for someone to act in a way against that really takes a massive emotional, psychological break. And I
Yes.
think we lose sight of that. And of course, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't want to don't want to project that I know anything that I'm talking about when it comes to psychology. It's just from the
Yeah.
observation. It's when we see people go down the road of radicalization and terrorism, same thing. I mean, they are taking they are stepping outside of their community, their family, whether it's religiously motivated or politically motivated. It is a it is a really big human step to take.
Yes. And just extending on this part of the insider risk and insider threat, because whenever I share these things with the people outside of the industry, especially the space and defense and intelligence, they cannot mostly relate to it, because the general public, for them, if I tell them that the Uber has insider threat department, and I know people also who are with Uber working as an insider threat specialist, they first get it. Okay, we thought there might be software engineers working at Uber. How come? What is insider threat and what is that basically? So therefore this question is specifically to give our listeners this perspective that insider threat is not something that only exists in defense industry, space industry, or intelligence. It exists everywhere. So from that perspective, like we often think that insider risk or insider threats are in defense or intelligence, but they are rampant in law enforcement and enforcement, casinos, healthcare, maybe even a pharmacy company, tech startups. Here in Europe, we have identified a lot of threats on the startup side. So from your perspective, what have you observed in terms of vulnerabilities across these seemingly unrelated sectors from your perspective? Yeah.
Yeah. So, and startups in particular, because you're still new. And it really, again, it's there tends to be a caste system, or a
Yes.
cultural norms that place certain types of employees, whether it's the C suite, or the senior management or subject matter experts. And then you have the logistics folks, the support roles, your finance officers, your IT support, for example, whoever's running that. You have janitorial services. You have individuals who are doing the purchasing and the mailing and the shipping and all of what we often think of as support roles. It's really more about the roles and not necessarily the profile of the person. I mean, obviously, racism, sexism, all types of isms in the workplace occur, and you know that can create that alienation. But it is often about the role. It's your sense of how you fit in to this bigger space. And consider it, take the journey, right? Say I am a young, smart college grad. I get a job, and I've been this is what I've been hoping for all along. I get a job in I don't know, software engineering firm. I'm super excited to show my stuff, right? But I'm put on maybe the, help desk for a while. Now, that makes sense from one perspective. I got to show that I'm a, hard worker. I have to prove myself. I get that, right? But
Yes.
let's just say I continue to feel like I'm proving myself. But I notice that our whole IT support desk, or whatever it is, um, we get no recognition. Maybe we are in the basement, of the building. Maybe we don't have any coffee station where we are. All these small things that suggest to you you are not as valued as an employee to this workforce, to this mission space. And you're working hard. Especially it's the hard worker, it's the smart person. It's not the lazy people or the people who don't want to work, or it's
Yes.
usually you know a smart person. um and so you can start to see that sense of I'm being treated unfairly, that sense of I'm being dismissed, my value is not appreciated, or my value is disproportionate to, or is disproportionate to what I know I do, what know I contribute. That starts to fester. And here, so let's just say I'm here 2 years later, and no one is, I'm not getting any kind of opportunity to move out of this particular role, and someone approaches me, or I just start realizing, I have access to what's being developed, this new IP that's being developed over here. I can take that to a competitor, or I can start my own business and I can be my own boss. You see the psychological
Yes.
aspects of it, and the desire to be more than who you currently are. These are all normal human ambitions, and when they aren't, there's no outlet for it,
Yes.
or they're not satisfied. Some people, especially smart and ambitious people, will find a way for themselves, and that's kind of how the journey begins, I think, from my perspective, or from my observations.
That's insightful. And like moving ahead to a little bit, I think touching a bit on the part of psychology. I know that you mentioned you're not a psychologist by profession, but still, just from a general perspective, I would like to touch upon this part. So you have worked on some of the most high-profile operations, including surveillance involving Osama bin Laden's family. How important is psychology understanding in both identifying and manipulating the targets as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's almost nothing more important, um, especially the more scientific and technology based we become as a human race, for us to understand still, um, the for me, psychology is not just about survival instincts and how you respond to, or how you perceive your landscape. It's also the emotional aspects of it too. We don't talk a lot about emotion and technology and emotion and security, and but yet
Yes.
we are full of emotion. Like, that's what makes us humans. So, um, I think it's really important, and one of the hardest things to do is to break the cycle of mirror imaging. So when you're dealing with, so for example, I'm not a terrorist. I am not, a member of a Red Army faction or anything. I have no loyalty to that kind of thinking. But I have to understand that kind of thinking in order to be able to prevent, recruits to anticipate what my target's next action, next move might be. And that, again, kind of like I was saying earlier, with having to even think about an insider, excuse me, having to think about an insider as a threat is it's hard because it is dark. You have to think the worst of somebody, and you might have to think the worst of somebody that you work with or like. I'm always reminded of Sandy Grimes, who was one of the women who helped identify Aldrich Ames, and the fact that at one point she and Rick Ames, carpooled. I mean, not only did they work on the same team, they were, going back and forth in the car together. Um, and how hard it is to be that close to somebody and then find out how much they have betrayed you and the organization and the people that you work with and have sworn to protect. So, in order to anticipate and get ahead of someone that you already know is a threat, like a terrorist, for example, you really have to understand their psychology. You have to understand their lived experience. You have to understand how they perceive the experience they're currently living in. And you have to break that cycle of mirror imaging. A lot of people say, oh, terrorists are not rational actors. They are rational actors. They're rational within their own world perspective. And that is what happens with insiders too. they begin to rationalize their actions because they
Yes.
create their own narrative of alienation. They create their own narrative of I'm worth more than this. And everything they do from there is rational from that perspective. One of my favorite examples of that is Benedict Arnold. you know, General Benedict Arnold was a very good friend and loyal to George Washington, but he had this narrative of he wasn't being appreciated, and so anyway, I don't want to digress too much, but you have to break the mirror imaging and you really need to understand the cultural underpinnings, the lived experience of the individual. And only when you do that can you, if you have the opportunity, speak to where they are if you want to try to
Yes.
move them to a different place. You cannot come in from somewhere in outer space. You have to be right there, right next to where their experience is so that it resonates with them before you can move them away from the path that they're going down. I don't really think
Absolutely.
of it as manipulation as much as it is influence, but people call it different things.
Yes. Well, that's definitely insightful. I think this perspective was really needed in the conversation because previously we had discussed, insider risk and insider threat as well. But the kind of deep dive that we are taking in the conversation right now, this has never happened. We had discussed this on a surface level, like, okay, what are the insider risk threats, what are the potential hotspots, that's it. But we never really took a deep dive into the emotions. Especially emotions is something that we have never ever discussed on the
I,
podcast. I think
I
even
don't
during the
doubt it.
counterterrorism, yeah. Because the counterterrorism analyst also of the former CIA, only, who came on the podcast, we were discussing about the live cases. So there's this one lady from I think Rand Corporation. She was working with the US Air Force posted in Syria and Afghanistan. So we were discussing about what kind of strategies they use, what kind of technology failure that happened, but never really discussed what is triggering all these things. What are the emotions behind this of both the aggressor and especially the person who is executing it. And that is something that is making this conversation very interesting. I'm looking forward to the more of the questions that I'm going to ask you. And I think this is the end of the part one for our listeners. We'll be back with the part two episode. So please stay tuned. And the people who will be directly shifting to the episode, part two of this episode, I recommend them to first listen to part one of the episode, because otherwise you won't be able to connect with the conversation in the part two. So, yeah, thank you very much.